You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is sponsored by X-Deep, and I'm very grateful for their support, which goes a long way towards making this podcast possible. When we look back at the history of sidemount diving, all roads lead back to the UK sump divers of the 1960s and the exploration of caves such as Wookey Hole in Somerset, southern England. The Cave Diving Group, or CDG, was central in this development as they started using side-mounted cylinders for sump diving to ease the burden of carrying heavy equipment through dry sections of cave during exploration projects. Their focus was on reaching the next dry section of the cave, and so the emphasis for their equipment development was all about optimizing for climbing and moving through narrow cave passages, and so a minimalist approach was taken. The Cave Diving Group has received a massive amount of press following their stellar involvement in the Thai cave rescue, but by their nature, CDG members tend to shun publicity in favour of getting on with the pursuit that they love, and that is cave exploration. So I felt it was way past time that I reached out to a leading British cave diver to find out more about cave diving in the UK and also the CDG. And I was really excited to get the opportunity to speak with Michael Thomas. Mike is the training officer for the Somerset section of the Cave Diving Group, is a TDI cave and sidemount instructor, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. In this episode, Mike and I discuss his background in diving, the CDG, their approach to diving, how they train, and their equipment. Plus we talk about the differences between cave and mine diving, the Thai cave rescue, all of this and much more on this episode of Speaking Sidemount. With me today I have Michael Thomas. Mike, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
And good. I think it's morning with you, Steve. So
It is.
Morning, Steve.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we're on opposite sides of the planet yet again. Mike, you're in Farnham in the UK and I'm in the far north of New Zealand.
That's correct, yeah.
I start most of my interviews with this question, which is getting you to share a little bit about your background in diving so we have some context and perspective on where you're coming from.
Okay, I started diving in 1987. Parents have a house on the Maltese island of Gozo in the Mediterranean. When I was sort of 14 years old, you don't want to be on holiday with your parents, but you're not old enough to be left at home. So I was kind of kicking my heels around the waterfront, and my father, in a fit of exasperation, said, "What do you want to do?" And we happened to be stood right outside of a dive shop. Mm-hmm. So I said, "Well, that looks like fun." And he's regretted it ever since because it cost him $8 for the first.
Exactly. Well, we shouldn't say this, but never let your kids start at 14 while you're responsible for the equipment purchases, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was he found that out quite quickly. Many thanks to them, I'm where I am now. But
yeah, mate. Thank God for birthdays and Christmas, huh?
Exactly. From that age of 14, I came back, did an initial course in Malta or Gozo, came back to the UK. The only diving clubs or agencies at that time that was in the UK was the British Sub Aqua Club. Mm-hmm. And I approached, or my parents approached on my behalf, several clubs in our area. And because of my age, under 16, none of them would really touch me. But one club that was fairly local down the road, which was Alton Bezac, said, "Come along, we'll see what you like. We will take you at 14. And the rest was history, really. I turned up and I joined a Bezac club and started novice diver training at 14.
Yeah, and I guess the enthusiasm of having a young adult coming through must have been kind of cool for them as well.
I guess so. Thinking back on it, there was no one near my age for several years. Right. It wasn't until I was sort of 16, 17 that I started meeting other divers of that age group in the United Kingdom at that time. I mean, we're talking sort of 1988 to 1990 at this point. Mm-hmm. And once I did many years of standard sort of British Sub Aqua Club, single set diving off of ribs, off of hard boats, etc., etc. And then in around about 1992, I met a cave diver at my local caving club. Now, what I have failed to say before we started was that all the time that I was diving, I was dry caving at the same time. So I had two sports that were running parallel to each other. Obviously, one was the dry caving and one was the open water scuba diving.
Mm-hmm.
And this gentleman, Malcolm Foyle, said to me, "Mike, you're a diver." And I said, "Yeah, I am." And Malc said, "You need to come with us." and my cave diving started in the summer of 1992. They needed some fresh muscle to help carry cylinders.
And I wonder, had you ever joined the dots and said, I wonder if I can join my passion for dry caving with my passion for diving?
To be honest, not until that meeting of the guy that went on to train me in cave diving,
mm-hmm.
I hadn't actually really contemplated it. It wasn't until this guy turned up at the caving club and said, "You're young and fit, you need to come with us." And that was very much how it happened within the cave diving group up until around about that point. Things are a little bit different now, but
mm-hmm.
back then it was still old school ways.
From that very beginning where you were introduced to cave diving, talk us through a little bit of your early cave diving training and career.
Well, I'd spent up until that point, I'd done sort of 5 or 6 years of open water diving. I'd put a twin set on maybe 2 or 3 times in that time, and that was all very exciting for us
mm-hmm.
back then.
Mm-hmm.
And the day that I started cave diving, it was in a cave called Hurtle Pot in the Yorkshire Dales in the north of England, which is now a fairly popular dive site for the many agency-trained cave divers in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And I turned up to go diving, and Malcolm handed me this Sidemount harness. And I'm looking at this thing, and he said, "Well, if you're going cave diving, you need one of these because that's what we use." It was in August 1992, I started Sidemount diving.
Right.
And I'd put this harness on, and it was a single point attachment harness. It was the old style Sidemount. It was kind of like a climbing harness with a big steel band that held the cylinder to your hips.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to put the cylinder into the harness first and then put the harness and the cylinders on all in one go. It wasn't like today where you put the harness on, then clip the cylinders on.
I can imagine what that would have looked like. Don a twin set's relatively rigid with the backplate and so on, and trying to don something with 2 cylinders that's moving all over the place must have been hilarious.
It did have a level of amusement about it, and we got quite good. We used to lay the harness and the cylinders on the floor, then step over it, then kind of bend down and pick the whole thing up and just drag it up your back and try and get it on your hips. With bigger cylinders, if we started using 12s or 15s on that system, we got quite smart. We started using shoulder straps to take some of the weight off your hips.
Yeah.
And so anyway, once I got kitted up, down to the water, there wasn't any specific side mount training. It was just, here's 2 cylinders, 2 regulators. You understand the rule of thirds. Let's go.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no side mount training. It was just, we used side mounts equipment because that's what we used.
Yeah. And then you went on from that. So was that initial training with the CDG or before?
Yeah, all of my initial cave training and side mount experience was with the cave diving group.
Mm-hmm.
Most trainees, even today, it's not an organisation that you can turn up and pay to learn to cave dive. It's a mentorship program. The only fees that you do pay go towards your third-party liability insurance and the journals that we produce.
Right.
Most students take around about a year from joining the cave diving group as a trainee diver to becoming a qualified member of the cave diving group. That's a year of fairly intensive diving, getting involved in projects.
It's a very, very different approach, obviously, and I love the concept of mentorship because I think it's a really important facet of diving, and I think most of the great divers that I know of, at some point in their history, they have a great diver who was their mentor, and they can almost point to that as a turning point in their diving. So you're now the training officer for the Somerset section of the cave diving group. The CDG's got a lot of press, obviously, recently in the last year since the Thai cave rescue. So I don't think many people really know what it is and how it operates. So I'm interested in learning more about the CDG in particular and that mentorship aspect and how you become trained and what's different about it from what most of us know as dive training.
The CDG mentorship program, when a trainee or somebody that thinks they may like to join the cave diving group approaches us, they kind of need to prove themselves a little bit. because they're not paying members of the cave diving group to train them, you end up spending a lot of time with that person, so you do have to like them.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a very small community. Within the cave diving group as a whole, across the country, there are less than 200 members.
Right.
We don't have huge quantities of members. So when a trainee does turn up, they need to fit. They need to find some people they get on with, that they can work with, and also that the qualified divers like them and can work with them.
Mm-hmm.
We do also try to share our trainees around a little bit. We try not to leave the trainee with one diver all the time, because that's not such a great idea, because they're only learning from one person. If you share them around, they get different views, different ideas, potentially different equipment configurations.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was learning to cave dive, I had two primary trainers, a guy called Malcolm Foyle and another guy called Robin Brown. But over time, I met more cave divers, and Rob Palmer, which you'll probably remember from the history books, I knew Rob from about 1995 up until his unfortunate demise in 1997. So Rob Palmer became one of my cave diving mentors, and Rob taught me an awful lot about diving on the other side of the Atlantic, American-style cave diving, because Rob was very active in the Bahamas. He was very active on that side of the Atlantic. And at that time, not many of us were. So to learn extra skills from someone like Rob, for me, was very, very good.
Yeah. And one of the things I notice is that you go to different parts of the world, and obviously there's different styles of side mount diving. So we have, the CDG UK sort of sump setups, Florida style, and then obviously Mexico, where you've got Bogotá, and where a lot of us come from. So how do you rationalize the contrast between different areas? Is it sometimes that the setups are very specific to the type of caves you're diving?
I think that's very true. A lot of the caves that we dive in the United Kingdom, I'm not talking mines here, I am talking caves. The access is reasonably restricted. A lot of the time you're caving either up to the dive site or between one sump and the next, wearing your cylinders. So we tend to be using, commonly, a 7-litre cylinder is a fairly standard size cylinder. And if we need larger cylinders, we tend to take more 7s than taking a larger cylinder, mainly because it's easier on the body to shift 1 7 at a time than heavier steels. We are using steel cylinders most of the time. And the reason behind that is dragging aluminium cylinders through the caves, you'll destroy the cylinder. You'll be taking meat and metal off that cylinder very, very quickly. Steels obviously have a lot longer lifespan in that environment.
Yeah, understood.
I do dive standard UK-style side mount harnesses. I also dive and teach through TDI. I've got an X-Deep. My son's diving a dive-right harness at the moment. I kind of take the harness for the dive that we're planning on doing.
Right, that makes sense. I use X-Deep Stealth 2.0 tech, and I dive a lot of different environments in it. And I understand that harness extremely well now in terms of how I'm going to set it up. However, I'm not typically sump diving. That's something that I haven't done. Yes, I'm cave diving, and yes, we can push through restrictions in that, but I tend to be doing more wreck diving and open water, deep diving. So let's talk about the stealth for a moment. When do you use that and when do you not? I think you told me that you'd modified it pretty heavily for your use as well.
Yeah, my stealth is modified. It's got some of Andrew Goring's...
I love his stuff.
some of his fine metalwork on it.
Yes.
But mainly, I couldn't be bothered to build it myself. My X-Deep is modified. I have a KISS Sidewinder rebreather. Yeah. With the rebreather attached to it, I was having real trouble getting into the harness as a Y harness. With help, it was fine. Doing it on my own was a bit of a non-starter. I've changed it to an H harness.
Yes.
The pull cord for the tail dump, the oxygen bottle for the Sidewinder sits right across the tail dump.
Right.
So Ed Sorensen taught me a lovely little modification to shift the pull cord up onto your left shoulder.
Yes, I've heard of that.
My XD, as I say, is fairly heavily modified. If I'm diving caves in France, large caves, or even some of the larger caves in the United Kingdom, if I'm in my dry suit, then I'm probably going to be in the X-Deep. If I'm in a wetsuit for cave diving in the UK, it probably means I'm going to be back in a standard British side mount harness. You're then back into sumps and carrying equipment through dry sections of the cave.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess as an outsider too, when I look at some of the sump diving, and I've seen photographs of some of the CDG stuff, sometimes the question comes to mind, how the hell do they not kill themselves? It's very, very different from what we know. Obviously, they do just fine, but the CDG's approach to equipment is really, really different.
It is very different. I'm sitting here smiling at you because I can see you smiling as well. It is very different. We touched very briefly on the Thai rescue.
Yes.
There's a beautiful shot of Rick Stanton walking through the car park outside the cave with a tyre inner tube on his back. I think with the CDG, it's a mindset. The equipment is, a lot of it's homemade, a lot of it's highly, highly modified. The guys that are doing this are not, they're not mad, they're not crazy, and they've put an awful lot of thought into what's going on. I was talking to Connor Rowe, one of the other lads that was out in Thailand recently. And X-Deep have just sent in the classic X-Deep wing with Cave Rescue written all over the back of it. So he's got an absolute and complete ribbon over this. He's now got to use it rather than his preferred homemade BC. Connor is still using a homemade side mount harness that he's built himself. It's been designed for him to wear a climbing harness alongside that side mount harness.
Yes.
So he can exit the sump and basically turn into a vertical caver and start prosecuting and abseiling up and down ropes wearing the same harness.
Yeah.
And you're never going to find a commercially available side mount harness that will do that job.
I guess the market's too small, and I understand that absolutely. It's really such a different application from what the X-Deep Stealth, for instance, was designed for. Even though Patrick Woodman is a really good climber as well and does some of that, it is a very different application than I think the Stealth was designed for. I've read a lot on the CDG training process, and a lot of it seems to be based on scenarios and solving problems both out of the water before you get in, such as building your own equipment, but also problem solving in the water. Can you talk me through a little bit about how you take someone through this mentorship in the training process?
Well, the big difference between a CDG style approach to training and when I teach full cave or intro to cave for TDI is obviously the agency cave diving training. It focuses on a team approach to entering the cave, looking around the cave and exiting the cave. A CDG approach is all of your divers are solo. There may be one or two divers together, but they are still solo within that team.
Yes.
If somebody else can help you, then all well and good, and that's what your mates are for. But you don't get into the water, and I don't launch a CDG trainee into the water with the feeling that if anything goes wrong, I'm going to be right there to sort it out. Because a lot of our cave passages is small and a little bit gnarly in places. And also, on a mediocre day, 1 or 2 meters visibility, I'll be quite happy with.
Right.
You know, if your diver is 2 meters in front of you, I can't see him. So if he does have a gas problem, I'm not going to know about it until he turns around. And if he can't turn around, he better be able to sort this out himself. These are not the type of caves that I'm going to be taking TDI or agency style cave divers into during a course, because it's obviously that's way outside of the standards for that course.
Sure. Understood. And it's interesting. I did my advanced wreck training with John Chatterton, and he had a very similar approach to wreck diving. He's gone on record as saying that he doesn't gas share. This is my gas, you've got your gas. If you've got a problem, I'll help you, but don't rely on me as a gas tanker. And it's very much a solo approach. So I do have some experience of that as well. And I get it, especially some of the more old school ways of diving.
It's funny, I've had conversations with some people and to them it sounds a little bit cavalier that you're not in a position to help the person that you've entered the water with. We had a practice rescue actually just before the Thailand rescue actually kicked off for real. We practiced a cave diving rescue, extracting a casualty through a sump in a stretcher. We didn't know at this point what was going on in Thailand.
Yes.
It was just that we decided that we should actually practice this skill. And on the way back through the cave with the stretcher, the visibility had dropped down to 0. And one of our divers that was basically propelling the stretcher at the rear end became detached from the stretcher and the line. It wasn't until we got back into clearer water that I realised that we were one team member missing. So at that point, we then go back into a standard lost diver drill.
Yeah.
This is no longer an exercise. The diver in question was quite happy, and he refound the dive line very, very quickly and was very calm and was swimming out. But we might come across as slightly cavalier, but the big and grown-up bits of us are still in place.
Yeah, and look, cavalier isn't actually the term I would have said, because everybody knows how professional the CDG is. I mean, they were there in the Thai cave rescue to actually execute on what needed to be done. So I think everyone realizes the level of professionalism. It's just this contrast between what you see with the homemade gear, I think, and the skill level of the diver.
That does tend to shock. Sometimes I think that we play on that a little bit, just for our own amusement in the pub.
I get it, yeah.
But most of the time, there isn't diving equipment that has been designed for what we want it to do. It's very different with diving big clear sumps in France or Florida or Mexico than dragging your equipment for hours on hours underground to get to the dive base.
Yeah, I hear you. And sort of touching back on this problem-solving thing, I had a chance to have a talk to Richard Harry Harris a while ago and had some really decent conversations with him about the dives they were doing in Pierce Resurgence here in New Zealand. And the dives are extraordinary, not only for the fact that they're going into these caves that are very cold water, but just the depths that they're getting to. And it seemed to me the attraction to them was the problem-solving aspect. So both he and Craig would come across something and they'd figure out how to solve that problem so that they could go a little further and make sure that they could come out safely. Do you think that's a major factor in what attracts people to the sort of cave diving the CDG does?
Yes, in a way. The dives that are being done around the world now are absolutely fantastic. There's some awesome guys and girls out there putting down some superb dives, you know, from your end of the world to Mexico to Norway. I think all cave divers are attracted by that problem solving, but especially exploratory cave divers. With a CDG, we are primarily dry cavers that have learnt to cave dive, rather than divers that have learnt to cave dive. I would say that the primary attraction for a cave diving group member in the United Kingdom is that they wanted to be able to progress the cave further. If the cave they've been working in or have an interest in has flooded sections, they would actually prefer to be able to push through that flooded section, surface as fast as possible, and then carry on running through the mountain.
Yeah.
They don't want it to stay underwater. They want it to come to surface. But then we have things move on and life moves on. And you've got dives, you know, Jason Mallinson in Pofo Azul. Jason's just pushed that thing to an absolute extreme. His aim was still to take that cave to surface.
Yes.
Even though Sump 2 was 5.2 kilometres long, Jason still wanted to take it to surface.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big difference in mindset.
Yeah, I understand that completely. And to be honest, the first time I kind of even thought about that very deeply was when I interviewed Nat Gibb, and she talked about her experiences in training dry cavers to be cave divers versus training divers to be cave divers. And she said exactly that. And I think the thing that struck her was the knowledge of the geology and the way caves work that dry cavers brought to the training. They already had an intimate knowledge of the environment. And so what they really had to learn was how to dive in this environment versus a diver coming to caves who really has to learn all the cave diving protocols, but then also has to learn that knowledge of how the geology and geography of a cave works.
That is a big one, and I notice exactly the same. When I'm teaching TDI full cave, I am teaching how the cave, or if it's a mine course, how the mine works, how the mine was built, how the cave is formed. And my agency divers are concerned that how their trim looks in the water, whether their cylinders are absolutely on the nose. But when I teach CDG divers, I don't have to teach them how the cave works. They're not fazed by the cave. If they get themselves slightly hung up in the cave, I can see them just feeling around to find out there's no stress from the cave environment. What I have to do with the CDG divers is effectively teach them to dive. So it's a little bit like doing an open water course, but in the cave environment. But I'm not worried about them being stressed by that environment.
Yeah, because they've already squeezed through little tight gaps, haven't they?
Some of the time, I have to put the brakes on them, and I'm putting the baby reins on them. So, like, come on, guys, you are actually underwater here.
The big difference is you're time constrained, aren't you? You know, if you get stuck in a cave when you're dry caving, well, okay, yes, you're time constrained, but you can be stuck there for some hours, no problem. But with a couple of 7-litre cylinders, the clock's ticking, right? Exactly.
It's not, as you well know, it's not a huge gas supply. And if stress levels do go up, then that's not going to last you too long. As I say, it's a very different mindset in teaching cavers to cave dive versus divers to cave dive.
Yeah, totally. You raised an interesting point, and I know you recently, an article was published in the TDI blog about the differences between diving caves and mines, and I think I saw you speaking on that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your perspectives on the differences between cave diving and mine diving?
It all came about because probably the latter half of last year, I'd had several conversations with technical divers that were mine diving in the UK. And all of them had said, oh, we're going cave diving this weekend. So I'd say, oh, where have you been or where are you going? And they would give me the name of a mine. And then when I started gently questioning them on what they thought a mine was compared to a cave, it was very blurred. As far as they were concerned, if they were underground, they were cave diving.
Right.
So I started thinking about this and thought there's a lot of differences, especially in the United Kingdom. You know, line traps in UK caves are very real, and there's lots of them. In the mine environment, yes, you've got line traps, but they're generally around pieces of mine equipment or bits of old railway and steelwork that's underground. And also, from a caver's point of view, cavers don't generally go into mines. They don't like them. Artificial environment, there's no original exploration to be done. If you're exploring a mine, you're just re-exploring it. If you want to find out where a mine goes, go to the library and pick up the mine abandonment plan, and it'll show you exactly where it goes.
Yeah.
So from a caver's point of view, they're not particularly interested. But then some of the cavers have started using the mines for training. So we end up teaching the differences about mines to the cavers and caves to the mine divers.
Yeah, I get it. And from my point of view, because I'm a big-time wreck diver, right? People often talk about overhead environments and say, hey, listen, cave diving is very similar to wreck diving. And I remember hearing way back, you know, a cave diver can dive wrecks, but a wreck diver can't dive caves. And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, interesting. That's kind of ignoring the differences between caves and wrecks, which is significant. And I think the same thing applies to mines. I think you're absolutely right. You know, mines are man-made, caves are not. And so mines, therefore, are designed for people to pass through them and to work within them, just as a ship is. And so they're going to have a very particular layout because of that. And they're going to have their own hazards and dangers and their own intricacies. And the exploration side of that, from my point of view, I would think, yes, you're going to somewhere that a man's been before, but you might be going somewhere certainly that you haven't been before, and maybe someone's never been there underwater before. I see them more like a historic, like going to a museum and walking back through history, just like a shipwreck can be, you know. So I haven't dived to mine. I'm really looking forward to doing it, but I would find it really interesting from a different perspective than caves, though, right?
Well, there's a couple of points here. I think you need to get yourself over to the UK because you've not done any sump diving and you've not done any mine diving. We could sort this out in one trip.
And I have family in Hampshire, so you're not so far away.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. There's some good beer in Hampshire as well.
There is.
But anyway, back to our point. I always start off lectures about the difference between caves and mines with a mine, to me, is very much like a shipwreck. There's more similarities between mines and shipwrecks than there is actually between mines and caves.
Agreed. So what you're pointing out there is the mine and the shipwreck, what's similar about them, they were both created by man. They're designed for people to pass through them. There's going to be equipment in there. I think that one of the big differences with mines is they tend to go very deep as well, which can be a challenge, but that's an aspect, and there's dangers in there. I think in your article, you pointed out the fact that caves, yes, collapses are possible, but the hydraulic nature of a flooded cave is such that it's relatively rare for the flooded sections to collapse, whereas inside a mine, the hydraulic aspect is there, but if you come into a bell or something like that, there's added danger there for sure.
You need to remember as well that when the mines were worked and dug, they're potentially 100, 150 years old, if not older. If the old miner decided 100 years ago that this section of mine needed a pit prop to hold the roof up, then there's a fairly good chance he knows more about mining than the diver does. And if it needed a pit prop 100 years ago, it still needs it now.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, that pit prop is probably slightly worse for wear, and your exhaust gas is now adding localized gravity to that area. If you're swimming under loose and unstable areas, people do need to be aware of what's above them.
Well, let me share a story from Truck Lagoon. I was there last year, and there's a section in the San Francisco Maru where you swim under a series of mines that are basically held in the deck above you in a rack, but the rack is completely deteriorated to the point that, in Pete's words, they're held in there by seahorse shit. So, yeah, for the CCR divers, no big deal, pass under and take care. But for the open circuit divers, we're typically breath holding under there because the last thing you want is your bubbles to dislodge what is eventually going to fall. And it's one thing to have structure, but it's another thing to have ordnance or explosives fall down on you, right?
Indeed. Going back to the side mount stuff, with the advent now of side mount rebreathers, we do have a lot of sediment and a lot of silt in British caves. And obviously, you've still got the dangers in the mine environment as well of unstable structures on the roof and the walls. So being able to utilise side mount rebreathers now, it is a bit of a game changer for us.
Yeah. Let's go down that path, because everyone who's listening to my podcast knows that I'm almost bizarrely interested in them at the moment. I spoke to Thorsten Velder last week about the T-Reb, and you mentioned the Sidewinder, and I've had a couple of guys on, had Brian Kaycock and Tom Crisp talking about the side kick. So I'm interested in the Sidewinder from your perspective in terms of the differences from the side kick and how you use it in your diving.
I got interested in the Sidewinder really when it was still in its development phase. I'd seen some photos that Ed Sorensen was playing with in the States, and I contacted Ed and said, what's the story with this unit? And I had a cave diving project in northern Greece in a cave called Maras, and the dive base was 7.8 kilometres underground. So there's 7.8 kilometres of dry caving to reach the dive base. The dive site had been dived once by local Greek divers many years ago, and they'd taken one diver and 2 7-litre steel cylinders to the end. So for us to go back, we needed to go back with something that was going to give us a good range over and above 2 7-litres. Otherwise, there was no point in going back.
Sure.
But I still needed something that would break down into man and woman manageable loads to carry nearly 8 kilometres underground. For me, that's where the Sidewinder came in. I found out that Ed was coming over to France to teach a course for some Polish lads. I joined them in France. So there was me and Ed and a load of Polish guys in France about a year and a half ago now doing a Sidewinder course. And I did probably 50 or 60 hours on that unit and then got very, very comfortable on it. It's a lovely little unit to dive. Took it out to Greece, took it to bits, carried it underground, and then we rebuilt the rebreather at the far end. I was launched into the sump with 2 other divers that obviously weren't diving as my surface support. And that was it. But unfortunately, the sump ended at a depth of 28 metres at a gravel squeeze, one of those horrible gravel squeezes that's at about 45 degrees, and the only thing that's holding the gravel back is the flow. As soon as I got into the squeeze, the gravel just started slumping around me. Any caver that's ever seen anything like that, you just run away at that point. It's a horrible, horrible thing, and it's probably got your death written all over it. So unfortunately, the cave didn't play the game, but the rebreather did. And
contrast the Sidewinder, have you dived the side kick as well?
I've done one try dive on a side kick. I've spent about half an hour on it. The thing I really like about the Sidewinder is the balance on the unit. Your open circuit cylinders, you've got one on each side still, and the cans are sat on top of the cylinders.
Yes.
So from a balance point of view, a walking around point of view, and what I wanted it for initially was its pack down size.
Yeah, much smaller, right?
Very, very small, and we split the unit down, and nobody's carrying ridiculous loads.
Very cool. Good to know. So you mentioned Gozo earlier, and as you may know, I spent some of my very formative years of diving there. I did 2 years of training and also worked at Gozo Technical with Tom Steiner.
With Audrey, yeah.
And Audrey, yeah, exactly. So, and had the time of my life. Also, you mentioned this before, but it was extremely formative. There's nothing like spending day after day in the water with great divers to improve your own diving. So I just loved the place and enjoyed that experience immensely. So do you get back to Gozo very often, or is it?
Yeah, my parents have still got a house out there. They spend the best months of the year out there and the best months of the year back in the UK. So yeah, I do go out there. I teach. I try and run 2 or 3 courses out there every year of various different things. So yeah, I do, and I've got a bit of a soft spot for the place. I learned to dive out there. I pushed my diving into what we would now call technical diving.
Yeah.
I don't think it had a name back in the mid-90s. I don't think Mike Mangino had actually called it that yet, or if he had, I hadn't heard of it. We would dive in some of the caves. There's the cave off of Record, Bottle Cave.
Yeah, Bottleneck.
Bottleneck, yeah. I think I was the first person to push through the restriction in Shrimp Cave.
Right.
Back in the early 90s.
That's near Billinghurst, right?
That's correct. Just kind of opposite and round the coast a little bit from Billinghurst.
Mm-hmm.
I was out there with my old style 1980s Sidemount harness in about 1992. I was told about Shrimp Cave by George Vella, who still owns the diving centre. And anyway, I went to look at it. There was absolutely no sign in the mud of any other diver passing, no dive lines in situ. So I'm pretty sure I was probably the first person to go through there. I took my son back there last year, just down to the restriction to have a look. It's amazing how having a little bit of helium, it doesn't look anywhere near as bad as it did then.
Assuming you did Bottleneck on air back in the day in 97 when that photograph on Facebook was done.
Of course it was. It was Trimix 210079.
We've dived it a few times, and we had a diver planning to do it on air, and Tom went ballistic. He hates that sort of thing. Of course, helium's cheap these days in Gozo, so it's never a problem.
It's a very different game now, and there's not one bit of me that says to do it now is a good idea.
Yeah.
But back then, back in the early 90s up to the mid-90s, I was asking George Vella to acquire oxygen from the hospital.
Yes.
In the mid-90s, and we would drive to the hospital. And I don't know, I probably don't want to know how he got those bottles of oxygen. And we would start mixing nitrox in his shop. And that was just it. That was the way we did it. And at the same sort of time, I did a couple of expeditions to the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. And in the Bahamas, again, there was no helium. We had oxygen, but no helium. So all the cave diving in the Bahamas, and the Sidemount cave diving I did with Rob, and the backmount cave diving in the bigger caves, again, it was all on air.
Yeah.
That's just the way it was, and we were either going exploring or we weren't.
Yeah, understood.
I'm not saying it's a good idea.
No.
It's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Some parts of the world we have a similar problem. I mean, in diving in truck last year, where helium was 15 cents US per litre. So we had to draw some different lines there in terms of where we would air dive versus trimix dive. Yeah. I did some quite deep air diving for me there, for a couple of 55-metre dives, which is similar to Bottleneck. It's only a little bit deeper in there, and I normally would not do that. I mean, the conditions are quite benign. It's very warm, very clear, and so on, but there's a little bit of an issue, and I think it does start to push you towards rebreathers as well, watching your bubbles go out and watching a few cents of helium go out with every breath.
I mean, I've got the KISS Sidewinder, an AP Evolution in my store, and Robert's got a JJ. So for any of the deep stuff we're doing, helium is your friend, especially on a rebreather. So
indeed. Now, I read on your Facebook page that you're a fellow at the Royal Geographical Society. What does that involve?
The RGS is not really a secret handshake society, but it does help if you know people that are already a fellow of that society. It's a little bit like the Explorers Club in the States.
Yes.
You get proposed by members I was proposed basically for some of the cave exploration that I did from in the sort of late 90s. We did a load of stuff in the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a big cave find in France in 2000. Between 2002 and 2008, we did multiple expeditions to a cave called the Subio in southeastern France that resulted in just over 2 kilometres of cave found. About 600 metres of that was diving, the rest of it was dry. And 2 friends of mine are also RGS members. And they just said, "Oh, you should be an RGS member." So I said, "Okay,
I'll do it."
It's nice, the RGS, because it gives you a base in London, and more importantly, it gives you access to the Royal Geographical Society library.
Yes, I imagine if you're researching somewhere, there must be.
If you're even just researching the country that you want to go to, if you're going to a country to go diving or caving, you can find whatever you like. I can email the library before I get there, and you've got a pile of stuff waiting for you
when
immense. You walk through the door. So for that sort of resource, it's very, very good.
Brilliant. And so what sort of fun diving are you doing now? So I know you're big time into instructing for the CDG and also TDI in both cave and Sidemount, but what do you do for fun diving?
I try at least, especially during the summer, I try for sort of a couple of days every month of just diving for me. In about 10 days' time, we're planning on a biggish dive in one of the mines up in North Wales that the son wants to go and do. And then we'll carry on up, and if the weather's good, we'll get some good cave diving in Yorkshire. But other fun stuff, I love my wreck diving as well. I love the history of shipwrecks, and off the south coast of England, we've got a fantastic amount. We've had 2 world wars, which is, unfortunately for the ships involved.
Yeah.
But fortunately for the divers, we have a huge amount of wrecks in all depth ranges, really, between 20 and 80. So if I'm not teaching, I'll either go for a nice cave dive, a nice wreck dive, or start working on my own exploration projects.
Yeah. And what projects have you got going in exploration?
At the moment, diving-wise, I haven't actually got a diving cave project at the moment. But what we have been doing is, for the last 2 years, we've been out to Kurdistan, which is one over from Afghanistan and in the area of the stands. We've been doing a lot of cave hunting, looking for new areas of caving. And what would be really nice is not only do we find an area of caving, that we find an area of cave diving.
Yes.
There's huge amounts of limestone in that area of the world, and very, very few cavers that have done much out there.
Amazing. Relatively safe to travel there, or?
We've had no problems at all travelling in country. Locals are super friendly. Dropping in through customs, again, no problem at all. The last big diving project was the one in Greece that unfortunately the cave didn't play the game.
Yeah.
From an exploration point of view, I've got quite interested in the stands at the moment.
It's always good to have something in front so that you're looking at that's going to be the next thing. So for me, I've got a trip to Mount Gambier coming up for the first time, so I'm really excited to have a look at that area. It's very much cave diving, but a lot of the guys there are also cavers. So I think that'll be my first sort of stepping stone into there, which will then lead on to some of the caves in Western Australia and in the Nullarbor, which I think will be super exciting. And I've found some areas in Niue Island in the South Pacific that I'm really excited about as well. So I'm going to go and have a look at that. And I think it's neat to have these little projects in front of you, isn't it?
You need to have something. Well, I do, and it sounds like you do as well. As a diver and as an explorer, it fires me up. It just keeps me going. It's like, well, what is around that corner? What is there? Well, one of the interesting dives that I've had earlier this year was on a training dive in Wookey Hole. It'd been the birthplace of modern cave diving in the United Kingdom. We were doing a training dive just after New Year, and there's some big floods that come through the cave previously in the last few weeks. The silt banks had all moved around at the lower end of the cave, and sat on the floor in front of me was what has turned out to be, after it's been dated now, is we found a 3rd/4th century Roman vase.
It's amazing.
It was just sat there complete on the bottom of the cave in the river.
Wow. And it had moved through flow and through the floods? Or been exposed?
I think it had been exposed by the floods, but the floods had come through. They'd moved the silt banks and just uncovered it. I can't see any reason why nobody else has seen this. unless it's been covered up. It was so close to the main route through. It was about 1.5 meters off the main line.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally, we do get exceptionally good visibility. I can't believe that nobody's never seen it.
Yeah. So what happens now? Do the archaeologists come in and close the cave? And
Well, Wookey Hole's a private cave. It's a show cave. So obviously I came out, I spoke to the cave management, showed them some pictures and said, what do you want to do with this? Because if it stays where it is, the chances are it'll get recovered again, and we'll lose it, or it will get damaged now because it is uncovered.
Mm-hmm.
So we surveyed the area. I've got into cave archaeology a little bit at the moment.
Sure.
Which has been a bit of a learning curve because I don't really know anything about cave archaeology, so I've had to learn quickly. I've finally removed it in situ, and it went to, I think, Bristol University. There was an archaeologist that specialises in ceramic pottery from that era. It was those guys that cleaned it up. They've now got it in some sort of preservation.
Right.
Dated it, and eventually it will return to Wookey and go into the Wookey Hole Museum.
Well, that's brilliant. Has anything similar been found there before?
Back in around about 1946, 1947, the Wookey Hole divers, after the Second World War, did a lot of archaeology in that same area, and a lot of human remains, pottery was pulled out, but nothing complete. As far as we know, this is the first complete Roman vase that's been found in Wookey.
Right. And any thoughts on how it got there? Or
Wookey Hole has got multiple chambers, and the river is obviously now running deeper than the dry chambers.
Mm-hmm.
Chambers 3 and 4 were historically used as burial chambers back in the Roman and Celtic era. Things have been washed out over the hundreds of years, ended up in the river, and then the floods will just push them and roll them down the riverbed until they reach the deepest point of the sumps.
Yes.
And then everything just drops out and settles in that sort of deep area. That's the best theory we've got of how it got to where it was.
Yeah, I sort of had images of some Roman drinking from a vase and then throwing it down a hole, sort of thing. Yeah.
You never know. He may very well have done that. They may have been having a party in Cambridge and he tossed the thing in the river. You just don't know. I mean, I like that story, to be honest.
Well, it's kind of the fun aspect of archaeology, isn't it? Is trying to figure out, how did this get here? How did they live? What happened?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's been I've had an interesting few dives working on that as a little side project.
Well, congratulations. That's an awesome find. And I love hearing those stories when, especially in places where a lot of dives have been done and then something all of a sudden appears. I think that's sort of special, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's good. It is good. And I was just so surprised to see it. I was just like, what is that? It's just, I looked at it from a distance and went, that's a very funny shape to be a rock. It's too smooth. Initially, I thought it was I was looking at the top of a skull.
Right.
I initially thought, and it wasn't until I started sort of wafting the silt away that the neck and the handle of the neck was completely exposed. And then it was like, wow, this is in one piece. This is complete.
Yeah. Very nice, very nice. Well, great to hear that. Mate, I don't have too much more. Is there anything that we haven't covered that perhaps we can on British cave diving, CDG?
I think the only thing I will say, with the CDG is a lot of people wonder how they can get involved with the CDG. The simple answer is come and talk to us.
Yeah, well, I think everyone wants to be a cave rescuer now, don't they?
I do get a lot of inquiries at the moment of how do I become a cave rescue diver? So that does amuse me a little bit.
It's super interesting because, obviously the guys have got a lot of very, very well-earned praise and recognition for the work that they did. And yet these are the guys who really don't crave that sort of recognition, are they? They would rather be...
Very much so. I mean, all of our trainee divers, part of learning to become a caver and a CDG diver is learning and attending practice rescue sessions.
Yeah,
our practice rescue sessions have now gone up in the world a little bit because the info that the 7 British lads brought back from Thailand is very, very helpful. They're working on updating and modifying our standard operating procedures for how are we going to get somebody out.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to ask this. It was in my mind when you talked about the stretcher rescue. I am sure what was in your mind during the stretcher rescue was that you were rescuing a diver.
Yeah, that is a good point. But we do have, in the United Kingdom, there are cases of cavers that are not divers being rescued through flooded sections of cave, or cavers that have injured themselves, and the easiest way to get them out would be to dive them back out rather than going through a small and tortuous dry passage.
Yeah, I get it.
But we're still not talking about children with very limited caving experience. So there is a big difference there.
Yeah, and hopefully that scenario never plays out again, but at least now that experience has been had and it's been done for the first time. So as you say, now if that knowledge comes back and becomes part of the rescue base of knowledge, then that's a great thing.
Without a doubt. And I think one of the sort of big things for us is when we practice these cave diving rescues, is you are treating the casualty, once they're underwater and underway, they are a package. They're not really treated as a diver anymore. All they have to do is breathe. Yeah. And hopefully they keep repeating that as necessary.
Exactly. I guess it helps keep their mindset as calm as possible and not having to worry about anything in terms of moving through the cave and through the water or dry passages.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, to be honest, I can't wait for the movie to come out. I think you could not script anything remotely like that. If you were the craziest script writer and you said, think of the movie Sanctum, right? Where every cave diving mishap that could possibly befall somebody befalls them in one movie. But the stories that came out of this, and even from the point of view of the relationships between the different divers and the different diving groups there, I think it makes for great drama. And then Chris Jewell losing the line and Harry coming through at the same time and taking over one of the boys. Of course, the very unfortunate fatality of one of the Navy SEALs. So you just couldn't write that drama.
You couldn't. You're right. You couldn't make this up. If you tried to make it up, you couldn't do it. We were sat here trying to sort out equipment for the lads to take. They went out there blind and they did all of them, all of the guys that were involved. It was just a superb effort.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I believe it was an effort that in most of our qualified divers in the UK, if they were asked to go, they would have gone.
Oh, sure. Yeah, agreed.
I think the big difference, and the thing that makes me laugh is when I get emails going, how do I become a cave rescue diver? I read the email and I think, well, I don't know, because none of us really want to do it. It's just you end up being involved with cave rescue because you're an active caver.
Well, I can't remember if it was Jason Rick or John who said this. Is just, look, this just happens to be our hobby and we're really good at it. And our hobby lends itself to us going into that environment and really not many other people can go there. That in itself, leads to, well, if somebody's stuck in there, it's you.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, mate, thank you very much. And thanks for bearing with me again with the technology problems in the beginning.
No problem, mate. Hopefully you get something out of this. So.
Oh, no, for sure. Absolutely. No, it's been brilliant. And thank you for the offer to come visit. Be careful what you wish for.
No, by all means, if you come over for one of the conferences or anything, just let me know. There's some very, very cool mine diving in the UK.
Yeah, that might be neat.
And some quality sump diving as well.
Then I'm not so sure about the mines. Put that on the list and we'll see about the rest.
I think we have got several caves that are that haven't got much caving to get to, and you get some good diving out of it as well.
Back to the Niue story, the beginning of us finding a couple of really, really beautiful areas there was, because I haven't done a lot of dry caving. I've been to Waitomo in New Zealand, which is an absolutely beautiful cave system, but unfortunately not very much diving there because there's a lot of runoff from the dairy industry here. And so a lot of them are full of mud and silt and so on. But the first part of it was crawling through it with a bit of a sandwich squeeze and trying to clamber down some rocks and then going down a chute, feet against one side and back against the other, and then letting go and falling into a pool and swimming under a ledge. And so it was a huge amount of fun. It was pure adventure.
Good stuff.
Thanks again, mate. I hope we can catch up soon.
Yeah, okay. I'll sign off now then, I guess.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.